Hi, I'm Allison Freeland, Director of Communications for the American University of Beirut in North America, bringing you highlights of a newly debuted program, the New York Beirut Briefings. We connect AUB faculty, students, and invited guests to discuss on-the-ground research from the Arab world. In this episode from December 2017, we look at the role of the correspondent in the Middle East. Washington Post columnist David Ignatius and AUB professor and journalist in residence Rami Khouri draw lessons from their long careers covering the Middle East and from the work of Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Anthony Shadid. From Beirut, journalism professor Dr. May Farah joins by video with some of her students and their participants also in the AUB New York City office. And if you'd like to see the briefing in its entirety, you can see it on the AUB YouTube channel.
Anthony had a quality that is too rare in our business, which is that he was a humble man. He never thought he was more important than the story that he was covering. He never thought he was more important than the people that he talked to. He was, it's funny, this is a rare thing in the news business, he was a good listener. He didn't interrupt to tell you what he thought, or he didn't interrupt to tell you what the story was, steer the conversation, just let people talk. He was a meticulous craftsman. I would sometimes, when I was going to Baghdad in the 2003-2004 period, stay in Anthony's room at our villa. Anthony would be away on a reporting assignment, and I'll never forget the way in which the sharpened pencils were lined up just so, and the stapler and the erasers and the notebooks. And this was an organized person who had learned the basics of his craft. And I thought, whatever else you'd say about Anthony, he was a poet and an artist. It began with that mastery of the basic tools. He was able to break out of a tendency we have in journalism to cover the world as if it's a sports event. We all know that experience where somebody will get up and say, so it was a good day today for Donald Trump, as you know, he announced, or Mahmoud Abbas had a rough week, as you know, and it's as if it's a sports event. You're going to kind of count up the runs, and that's how you're going to cover it. And Anthony understood that whole approach, the idea of covering what somebody said yesterday in a public forum, as if that's the essence of the story, was a mistake, and that you needed to go to the deeper reality of the story. One way to put it is that he was prepared to ignore the advice of his desk. I was a foreign editor of the Washington Post once, and our very best correspondents learned to ignore my advice and anybody else's. David Remnick was one of my Moscow correspondents, and David did what he damn well pleased. He's one of the greatest journalists in the world, but I remember when he was a young man, if I called him from the desk to suggest a change in his lead or some trivial fact, he would just hang up the phone and go back to what he wanted to do, and he was good enough to get away with it. And the story that he wanted to cover was the real texture of life as it was experienced in the Arab world. And that meant connecting with people at a level below where news events, in quotation marks, happen. So Anthony would go out to the booksellers in Baghdad, and the street where people for a century had been talking about books and writing. He'd go find the artists and poets. He was deeply curious. He didn't accept the kind of meta-narratives that often were a product of what the big editors in Washington or New York thought. He let the story emerge from his own experience in reporting and curiosity. What is it? What's going on here? And that's one reason that his stories often have a contrarian quality. They just went the other way because they express not the dominant narrative that had been put together back in America, let's say, but they express the narrative that emerged from talking to people. Today, I don't need to tell you, people do not let us travel as freely as we did. It's still possible if you're willing to take enormous risks. We have a few colleagues, Robert Fisk that comes to mind, who's ready to brave going into places where he doesn't know that he'll be accepted. But the firepower now is so intense, so dangerous to move around, that there's come to be a feeling that you need to be embedded with one side or another when you travel. And that has terrible negative consequences. It means you see the story not whole, not, this morning I'm in West Beirut, this evening I'm in East Beirut. You see one side of it because you're embedded with that side. And I think that's something that we, in journalism, initially thought we wanted. We kept saying to the Pentagon, to other militaries, please let us travel. Please give us accreditation so we can cover the story from the inside of the tank or armored personnel carrier. And I think we've gotten into this embedded world. I covered the 2003 invasion of Iraq, not as an embedded reporter, but on my own. And it was not easy, but I saw things you couldn't see otherwise. And the main thing I saw was, even in the first week of that war, there was an insurgency. The Americans were still surprised 6 months later. Well, if you've been traveling behind that, as one of the TV correspondents said, this racing arc of steel moving toward Baghdad. The typical TV, if you had not been in the arc of steel, that you've been talking to people in the towns that were, what you found was there was an organized resistance.
Immediate coverage of the Jerusalem issue by the American media in particular, which I can follow closely because I'm here in the United States now. And it perpetuates the problems that I've seen in the last 50 years of my career, which is a tendency by the media, even the quality media, to focus on one or two dramatic dimensions of the situation, whatever it may be, without sufficiently giving deep context to why these things are happening. So the great example now, of course, is the coverage of Jerusalem. And it started immediately as Trump was making his speech the other day. The media started talking about, is there going to be violence? Is there going to be another intifada? And of course, that's what the coverage is focused on. People in the streets and tear gas and this and that, without sufficiently explaining why this is going on. Now, when this same thing happened in Ferguson or in Baltimore, the American media did go beyond the violence and explain why it was happening. It did go talk to the local people who were in the streets, as well as the policemen and the politicians. It did provide representatives of the demonstrators, mostly African American and other people on the streets in Ferguson or Baltimore or other places. They were able to present their views on television themselves. This doesn't happen very much. It happens rarely, but not much, when it's dealing with coverage of Palestinians, Arabs, and other people in situations like this. So there are exceptions, of course. There's some outstanding journalism done in the United States by mainstream media and by other media, but it's episodic, whereas the rule is to avoid the context and to focus only on the violence without understanding the total picture. So his work so fascinating to me, and I think has lessons for us, is that he didn't necessarily go and pick out people that were necessarily representative of certain groups. So just, for instance, he wouldn't necessarily go and pick out a local human rights activist or a local protester who's leading a march. He would just walk into a cafe or walk into a bakery shop and start talking to people, say, what do you think about what's going on? And he'd ask them, what do you think? He didn't ask them, what do you think is your government's view? What do you think? So the lesson there is that he genuinely, in his personality and in his reporting, he genuinely showed that he cared about what an ordinary person felt. The views of these ordinary people are, first of all, very nuanced. That there isn't, people call me up sometimes and say, what do the Arabs think of Trump? I say, well, you tell me what does the Republican Party think of Trump? Well, there's a whole range of views. What do the American people think of Trump? There's a wide range of views. So in the Arab world, it's the same. There's a whole range of views, of different views. So there are nuances in what people think across our our region. The second, more important point, possibly, is that he showed that the views of ordinary people, while they matter, while they are nuanced, are also not particularly unique in the sense that what ordinary Arabs feel is exactly what most ordinary Americans or Europeans or Japanese feel. In other words, the range of sentiments that people have and the driving forces of those sentiments are absolutely universal. So if you could read Anthony's articles and you go and read the coverage of Ferguson, and you're going to find virtually identical human responses to predicaments of poverty, inequality, perceptions of oppression, police brutality, occupation, colonialism, exploitation. Basically, when human dignity is shattered, people respond in a certain way.
The gold standard is the way National Geographic kind of covers stories through an anthropological, historical, contextual approach. And we can't do that in daily journalism, but we can strive to. I won't take any more time.
I think there is a huge appetite among audiences for meaningful coverage. And I think that all of the kind of shallow clickbait stuff aside, what people are looking for is, journalism that fully follows like the implications of the stories that they're uncovering. I think The Intercept, for example, is a good example of a media outlet that remembers that journalists are supposed to be adversarial to power, and to call